Sergeant Callum Voss lost both eyes at Mosul. A roadside device, 2017. 7 years of darkness followed, no color, no shape, no horizon. Then Neuralink Solutions offered him a slot in their Phase 3 trial, experimental cortical implants, 32 candidates worldwide. He said yes before they finished the sentence. They activated his implants on a Tuesday morning in a sterile lab in Zurich. He opened his new eyes, and he screamed. The doctors assumed it was sensory overload. Standard reaction, they told him. The brain relearning light after 7 years. They gave him a sedative and dimmed the room. But Callum wasn't screaming because of brightness. He was screaming because the hospital ceiling didn't stop where it should have. Beyond the plaster, beyond the roof, beyond the sky, something enormous hung over the city. Perfectly still, perfectly patient. He couldn't look away because it was everywhere. He described it as a lattice. Translucent, geometric, rising miles above Zurich in interlocking patterns that defied anything he'd studied in engineering school before enlisting. It wasn't shimmering. It wasn't moving. It sat over the city the way a bell jar sits over a specimen, complete and closing, deliberate. The doctors exchanged glances. They ran a full diagnostic. The implants were functioning within normal parameters. Every single metric was green. Dr. Asha Patel, Neuralink's lead neuroscientist, flew in from Boston within 14 hours. She designed the implant architecture herself, a mesh of 64,000 synthetic photoreceptors mapped to the visual cortex. She sat with Callum in a darkened consultation room and listened. When he finished, she pulled up his implant's raw data feed on her tablet. There was nothing anomalous in the signal. She told him this clearly. He told her to look out the window. She looked, she saw Zurich. Rooftops, the river, the distant Alps, nothing else. Callum stood beside her, gripping the windowsill. He described arches 3 kilometers high, joining them at tessellated curves. He described nodes where the lattice thickened, pulsing with something that wasn't quite light. Asha watched his pupillary response. His synthetic eyes were tracking something. The microsaccades were real. His brain was processing visual information that her eyes could not detect. She ran him through every test in the protocol. Color matching, depth perception, edge detection. He passed them all flawlessly. Then she created an off-protocol test. She asked him to sketch what he saw beyond the window. He hadn't drawn anything in years. His hands trembled. But in 40 minutes he produced a diagram of such geometric precision that Asha's breath stopped. The pattern wasn't random. It had mathematical regularity. It looked engineered. Neuralink's corporate response was swift. A senior VP named Marcus Hargrove arrived from their headquarters in San Jose. He reviewed Callum's files, met with Asha privately, then sat down with Callum. His message was simple. The implants operated on a specific electromagnetic spectrum. Occasionally, atmospheric interference, ionospheric scatter, solar flare residue could produce persistent visual artifacts. This was documented. This was known. It would fade. Callum asked if atmospheric interference could produce geometrically perfect structures visible from every angle at consistent scale across the entire city. Hargrove smiled the way people smile when they want a conversation to end. He said the brain is a pattern-seeking organ. That's all this was. Pattern imposition on noise. Callum nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He'd learned in Mosul that the people most certain were usually the least informed. That night, Callum borrowed a hospital laptop and searched for the other 31 trial participants. Their identities were confidential, but Neuralink had published a trial registry with anonymized location data. He cross-referenced activation dates. 14 patients had been activated before him. He found through veteran support forums, a Marine in Chicago, a former UN peacekeeper in Nairobi, a demolitions expert in Sao Paulo. He sent each of them the same message. What do you see above your city? The Marine Staff Sergeant Dina Kowalski responded in 11 minutes. Her message was 4 words long. You see them too. The peacekeeper in Nairobi, Gabriel Ndungu, replied an hour later with a photograph of his own sketch. Different city, different continent. The same lattice geometry. The demolitions expert in Sao Paulo didn't respond. Callum would later learn that Neuralink had deactivated her implants 3 days after activation. Citing calibration irregularities, Callum showed Asha the sketches side by side. Zurich, Chicago, Nairobi, 3 different hands, 3 different cities, the same impossible architecture. The lattice structures varied in scale. Nairobi's was wider, Chicago's taller, but the geometric language was identical. The node patterns, the curve ratios, the way the arches intersected at precise 60-degree intervals. Asha stared at the drawings for a long time. Then she closed her office door and locked it. She told Callum something she shouldn't have. The implants weren't designed to replicate normal human vision. They were better. The synthetic photoreceptors captured a wider electromagnetic range than biological eyes, dipping into near-ultraviolet and far infrared. Neuralink marketed this as enhanced dynamic range. but it meant the implants could perceive wavelengths that natural human eyes had never evolved to see. If something existed only in those frequencies, only implant recipients would know. Callum asked the obvious question. Why hadn't Neuralink investigated this? Asha's expression tightened. She said the company had received similar reports from Phase 1 and Phase 2 participants. Every single one. The official response was always the same: visual artifacts, neural noise, calibration drift. She said 14 Phase 2 participants had their implants voluntarily deactivated after reporting persistent hallucinations. 2 had been involuntarily committed. She had found no record of anyone investigating what they actually saw. That was when Callum understood. Neuralink wasn't ignoring the structures. They were actively preventing anyone from confirming them. Dina Kowalski in Chicago confirmed it. She'd reported the structures to her Neuralink liaison and was immediately scheduled for a firmware recalibration that would narrow her implant's spectral range. She'd refused. Her benefits were suspended the following week. Neuralink's pattern wasn't negligence. It was containment. Callum and Asha began working in secret. She couldn't see the structures, but she could analyze his implant's raw sensor data in ways the standard diagnostic software wasn't designed for. She wrote a custom parsing algorithm in 3 sleepless nights. When she ran it against Callum's visual feed, the results stunned her. There was signal where there should have been none, consistent, structured, faint electromagnetic emissions in the 380 to 395 nanometer range, right at the edge of human visibility, just beyond it. Asha isolated the signal and mapped it spatially. What emerged on her screen was a 3-dimensional wireframe that matched Callum's sketches exactly. The lattice over Zurich was real. It was emitting at wavelengths that human eyes couldn't detect, but Neuralink implants could. She sat back in her chair. Her hands were shaking. She said very quietly, "This has been here the whole time." Callum said nothing. He already knew. They needed more data points. Callum reached out to Gabriel in Nairobi and coordinated simultaneous observation windows. While Callum mapped Zurich's lattice from 6 locations across the city, Gabriel did the same in Nairobi. They compared results in real time. The structures were not identical. Each was uniquely shaped to its city's geography, conforming to the terrain below like a shell grown around its contents. But the engineering principles were the same, and neither structure had a single visible seam. Asha began researching the spectral range independently. She found something disturbing in atmospheric physics literature from 2003, a paper by a Japanese researcher named Dr. Hideo Kurosawa, documenting anomalous electromagnetic emissions in the 385 nanometer band over Tokyo. The paper had been retracted 6 months after publication. The retraction notice cited instrument error. Kurosawa had died in 2005. His lab had been defunded. His data archives were missing from every institutional repository she checked. Callum started cataloging the structure's behavior. They were still, perfectly unnervingly still. No vibration, no thermal fluctuation, no response to weather, aircraft, or radio signals. They existed in absolute patience, like something waiting. He spent hours on rooftops watching them. He noticed that birds sometimes curved around nodes they couldn't see, that clouds passing through the lattice occasionally paused for a fraction of a second before continuing. The structures were interacting with the physical world, subtly, invisibly. Marcus Hargrove arrived in Zurich again, unannounced. This time he wasn't smiling. He sat Callum down and presented a document, a voluntary deactivation consent form. He said the company was concerned about Callum's mental health. The persistent hallucinations, the conspiratorial behavior, the contact with other trial participants in violation of his NDA. He said deactivation was in Callum's best interest. The alternative, he implied, was legal action. Callum read the form carefully. Then he folded it into a paper airplane. Asha confronted Hargrove privately. She told him about her data, the parsed sensor signals, the spatial mapping, the corroborating observations from 3 continents. Surprise. She got none. Hargrove looked at her analysis, nodded slowly, and said, "Dr. Patel, the company is aware of electromagnetic anomalies within the implant's operational range. We have chosen not to characterize them publicly because there is no actionable conclusion to draw. This is not a cover-up, it is triage." Asha asked what he meant by triage. Hargrove's composure cracked just slightly. He said Neuralink had mapped the structures over 11 cities during Phase 1. They had engaged 3 separate defense consultancies. None could identify the material, the origin, or the purpose. One consultancy had recommended immediate public disclosure. Another had recommended permanent suppression. Neuralink had chosen a third path: pretend the question didn't exist. Hargrove said, "If you announce invisible alien architecture over every major city, civilization does not continue normally." For the first time, Callum felt fear. Not of the structures, they had been there his entire life without harming anyone. Fear of what it meant that they were designed to be invisible. Whatever built them had chosen concealment, had calibrated the emission frequency to fall precisely outside human perception. That wasn't accidental. That was a species studying human biology, identifying the exact boundary of human sight and building 1 nanometer beyond it. They knew our eyes. They had measured us. Callum flew to Chicago to meet Dina in person. She was living in a one-bedroom apartment on the south side, blinds drawn. She'd been mapping Chicago's structure obsessively, pencil drawings taped across every wall, hundreds of them, each from a different vantage point. She'd assembled a composite. The structure over Chicago was a dome. Not a cage, not a lattice, a complete enclosure, seamless from foundation to apex, sunk into the bedrock beneath the city. It went underground. Dina had noticed something Callum hadn't. The structures weren't static over time, they were growing, slowly. She'd measured the same node cluster from her rooftop every day for 4 months. The nodes had migrated 7 centimeters upward. At that rate, the structure's apex would complete its final closure in approximately 19 years. She showed him the math. Her hands were steady. Her voice was not. She said, "They're finishing something, Callum. We're watching something being completed around us." Callum contacted Gabriel in Nairobi and asked him to measure growth rates. Gabriel confirmed Nairobi's structure was growing too, slightly faster than Chicago's. He'd calculated 17 years to completion. Callum checked his own Zurich data. 21 years. The structures were growing at different rates, but they were all converging. Every structure over every city would complete within a narrow window, roughly 2 decades from now. Whatever was being built would be finished everywhere, all at once. Ashad dove deeper into the electromagnetic data. She discovered the structures weren't just emitting, they were receiving. Faint signals pulsing at intervals of exactly 3 seconds arriving from outside the atmosphere. She traced the signal origin to a point beyond the moon's orbit, but the source wasn't fixed. It was moving in a slow, deliberate arc around the Earth. Something was in orbit, something large enough to broadcast to every structure simultaneously. It had been there for decades, at minimum. Callum brought everything to Ashad's apartment in Zurich. The growth measurements, Dina's dome calculations, Gabriel's Nairobi data, the orbital signal. They spread it across her kitchen table. They stared at it. The picture was clear, but its meaning was not. An unknown intelligence had built invisible enclosures around every major human city. The enclosures were growing closed. Something in orbit was coordinating them, and no human institution was willing to acknowledge any of it. Then Callum asked the question that changed everything. He asked Ashad to check whether the structures existed over unpopulated areas. She repurposed a spectral analyzer to scan in the 385 nanometer band. It took her a week to get access. The results were immediate. No structures existed over oceans, deserts, forests, or farmland. Only cities, only where humans gathered in large numbers. The structures weren't enclosing geography. They were enclosing populations. Callum flew to Nairobi to meet Gabriel. In person, Gabriel was quiet, deliberate, a man who'd spent 15 years mediating conflicts in places the world preferred to forget. He'd been thinking about the structures differently than Callum or Dina. He didn't think they were cages. He pointed out that the lattice geometry allowed air, light, weather, and biology to pass through freely. Nothing was being blocked. The structures weren't barriers. Gabriel said, "What if they are shelters?" The word changed everything Callum felt when he looked up. Shelters, not traps, protection. Against what? Gabriel had a theory. He'd studied the node clusters and realized they weren't random. They concentrated at structural stress points, the way an engineer reinforces a bridge at load-bearing joints. The structures were engineered to absorb force. Enormous force, something directional coming from above. Gabriel believed the structures were blast shields, and whatever they were designed to stop hadn't arrived yet. Ashad confirmed it. She modeled the lattice geometry against known force dissipation architectures. The resemblance to advanced blast mitigation structures was unmistakable, but scaled to a level that implied threats no human engineer had ever considered. She estimated the completed structures could absorb energy equivalent to a small stellar event directed at the Earth's surface. Someone had looked at humanity's cities and decided they needed to be armored against a catastrophe that humans didn't yet know was coming. Callum sat on Gabriel's balcony in Nairobi as the sun set, watching the invisible lattice catch frequencies of light he'd never been born to see. He thought about the builders. They had studied human eyes to know exactly what humans couldn't perceive. They had studied human cities to know exactly what to protect. They had worked in silence, in patience, in absolute invisibility, not because they feared humanity, but because they didn't want to cause panic. They were protecting a species that would never know to say thank you. Dina called at 3 a.m. Nairobi time. She was breathless. She'd been measuring Chicago's structure and found something new, an opening. A single gap in the lattice near ground level, precisely 1 meters tall by 8 meters wide. human-sized. It hadn't been there a week ago. Inside the opening, her implants detected something the rest of the structure didn't have: a surface with markings. Regular, deliberate markings, not decorative, linguistic. The builders had left a message, and they'd made a door to reach it. Callum was on a plane within hours. Dina met him at O'Hare with a car. The opening was in an alley behind a laundromat on West Madison Street, invisible to every passerby. Callum stepped through it and felt the air change, thicker, warmer, humming at a frequency he felt in his teeth. Inside was a smooth surface covered in raised symbols, thousands of them arranged in spiraling patterns. He ran his fingers over them. He was blind for 7 years. He knew what this was immediately. It was Braille, not human Braille. The symbols were different, but the principle was identical. Information encoded in tactile raised points designed to be read by touch. The builders hadn't just studied human vision. They'd studied human blindness. They knew the implants would grant sight to people who had learned to read with their hands. The message wasn't for anyone with eyes. It was specifically, deliberately, exclusively for people like Callum, people who could both see the structures and read by touch. They had planned for him. It took Callum and Dina 4 days to decode the message, working in shifts, correlating symbol frequencies against mathematical constants until patterned. The message was simple, devastatingly simple. It contained a date, 14 years from now, and a description of an event. A radiation burst from the galactic core that would sterilize every unshielded surface in the Milky Way's habitable zone. It was not a threat. It was not a weapon. It was a weather forecast. And the shelters were an umbrella offered by strangers. The message ended with something that made Callum sit down on the cold alley floor and press his palms against his synthetic eyes. A single line, repeated 3 times for emphasis, as if the builders understood how difficult it would be to believe. Translated as closely as the symbol system allowed, it read, "We cannot stay. The burst will reach us too. We built what we could, be well. They weren't gods. They weren't even safe. They were refugees passing through." Stopping just long enough to warn the neighbors, Callum gave the data to Asha. Asha gave it to 3 astrophysicists she trusted. Within a month, they had independently confirmed anomalous radiation signatures consistent with an approaching galactic core burst, previously classified as background noise. The timeline matched. The science held. The shelters were real, the threat was real, and 14 years was both too little time and just enough. Callum didn't go public. He didn't need to. He went to Neuralink and asked them to stop deactivating implants. He asked them to make more. Marcus Hargrove, to his credit, listened. On some quiet nights, Callum stands on the roof of his Zurich apartment and watches the lattice grow, 2.7 centimeters at a time. Patient, unhurried. Built by beings who measured human eyes, learned human blindness, and trusted a handful of broken soldiers to read their warning in the dark. He thinks about them out there, fleeing the same storm, with no one building shelters for them. He hopes they made it. He will never know, but he keeps watching, and the structures keep growing. And for the first time in his life, the thing he cannot see is the thing that saves him.